Welcome to today's webinar on Accused as Guilty, the big social injustice. The focus today will be on Matthew Lau's views, as we'll be discussing his research and views about the claims of social justice or social injustice in Canada. So welcome, Matthew. I'm excited to meet you again today, and I'm sure our viewers will as well. I know your background is economics, and yet you found yourself into the world of social injustice or social justice. And I've looked at the book of Thomas Sowell, and boy, it shook me up a little bit. And you've taken the Canadian perspective. I'm going to read a little bit of the background that I included in this week's newsletter, because I think it's a good orientation to the session, and it's written under the topic, "The Elitism Myth, a Misguided Accusation Against Canadians." And I'll share with you, I got some assistance from ChatGPT in putting this together. Recently, a disturbing narrative has surfaced, indiscriminately branding Canadians, I guess that's all of us, as elitist, racist, and privileged. This narrative, driven by generalizations and assumptions, wrongfully accuses Canadians of exhibiting traits typically linked with superiority and exclusion, and serves to embolden the alleged victims. Suddenly, labels are hurled: white, male, racist, homophobic, intelligent, wealthy, privileged, elite, successful, accomplished, oppressive. This verbal onslaught is more than a personal attack. It's a sweeping indictment of the entire nation's identity. Well, you're our savior, Matthew. You're not sure that there's a lot of truth behind all that. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background first, because it came as somewhat of a surprise to me that an economist would have so much insight and interest in the social matters.
Right. So my background is in finance and economics, but I think the social matters are inescapable today. They're just everywhere in the news, and they're just such a big part of public discourse. And they've always been um, somewhat connected to economics. Many decades ago, actually, Gary Becker, who was a University of Chicago economist, did a lot of research on connecting economics with a lot of social phenomena, such as discrimination. And he won a Nobel Prize in the 1990s for that. You mentioned Thomas Sowell, who was just out with a new book, Social Justice Fallacies. And what he does in that book is he examines a lot of the claims that are out there, whether they're, and a lot of these claims are economic claims. You know, there's some of the words you put out there, oppression or privileged. Well, sometimes you can look at some of the stats or some of the numbers to see, well, who is privileged, or is there oppression going on? And a lot of the social justice people say that because here's my prescribed solution. And that's another place where economics comes in, is, do those solutions actually work? And a lot of the times, what Sowell finds in his book, and it's the same thing, that's an American book, but you see it in the Canadian context as well, is that a lot of the claims fueling this social justice crusade, the numbers and the facts just don't back it up.
What is the most stunning data that you were able to assemble?
Well, one of the ones that it's obviously a very big claim in Canada and in the United States, is this idea that society is full of systemic white privilege or institutional racism and things like that. So one thing Thomas Sowell found is, if you look at the income data, for example, is that a lot of people from minority backgrounds, on average, will have higher earnings than the white population. So, for example, he finds that the median incomes of Americans of Chinese and Japanese and Indian and Korean ancestry all have, on average, higher incomes than white Americans, and this is based on the 2019 U.S. Census. So, one of the one of the conclusions of that is, it's very difficult to say, looking at the data, that the United States is a society that systemically oppresses minorities if you have all these minority groups that tend to be at the top of the income ladder. Same thing in Canada. StatsCan has done some work on this, and they looked at the average weekly earnings of Canadian-born men and women, and they found that they segmented society into the white population versus 10 different minority groups, and they found that about of men, 4 of the 10 minority groups had average weekly earnings higher than the white population. And I think among women, it was 7 of the 10 minority groups. So it's very hard to look at the evidence and conclude that we're a society that is systemically, oppressing minorities and at the benefit of the white population.
It's interesting to have discussions of this nature and draw on statistics, because when you're using statistics, of course, you're talking averages, and I'm not an average. I just happen to be an individual, and whether I fit that average and where I am on that average, who really knows, without digging into my own personal experience, my own personal behaviors. And I think that's one of the big dilemmas we have here, is these broad brushes that are being painted as if we are all a single Canadian profile. The generalization just doesn't fit, and yet we've got to live under that label. It seems to be we've gotten big on labeling.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right when you say the average can't describe the individual. And certainly there are individual acts of racism or discrimination and injustice. But the idea that, I mean, an average can be a useful tool for looking at society as a whole and saying, is there any kind of systemic discrimination or institutional discrimination? And I think a lot of these statistics are very helpful in saying that, well, the evidence in favor of that theory is just not there.
Well, if we've got the number of 100%, which represents all Canadians, at what point do you say it's a majority, or it's systemic? Is it systemic because it's 70% or 5%? And any sense there of what we're talking about when people are using that number of systemic?
Well, the way I usually think about systemic is, I mean, if you look at an institution and they have written rules that enforce discrimination. So, for example, if you go back many decades ago to when universities had quotas on the number of Jewish students, for example, or they wouldn't let people of a certain color into their building, that would be systemic discrimination. I don't see much of that or any of it at all, really. If you look at Canadian society today, obviously, like I said, there's always going to be individual acts. But as to the claims we always hear about systemic racism in society, I don't find too much evidence of it.
Let's switch for a moment to affirmative action. I don't know whether we have equivalents in Canada. I certainly know of affirmative action, how it's been applied in the United States. And many people have celebrated that with government intervention, we can right the wrongs, we can rebalance the opportunities. And Sowell in his book points to affirmative action in Berkeley, and how 80% of the Black students that entered into Berkeley under affirmative action failed, that they weren't ready,
Yeah.
that they were given an opportunity, but the opportunity was a waste and an embarrassment to them. Any comments or any equivalents of data of that nature that might apply to the Canadian context?
Yeah, I mean it's harder to find in the Canadian context. There's just the data's not there, but there was actually an interesting story, I think, in the National Post a couple days ago about I don't affirmative action in government hiring and so on. But the university admissions that you bring up, which has been a very hot topic in the United States, I mean, Sowell and others have pointed out there's really, um, it hurts everyone, right? There's people who are qualified to enroll in a certain program that are going to lose their spot to another person just based on their skin color. And if you're admitting people into university programs or into any spots that they're not qualified for and they only got because of their racial background, you're not doing them any favors either by putting them in a position that they're not really in a good spot to handle. You cited that statistic from Berkeley where most Black students, they were actually very good students. Maybe they were in the 80th percentile, in terms of their scores when they were applying to universities, and they could do very well in almost any school. But when you put them in an elite program where most of their classmates are in the 99th percentile and they're only at the 80th, then you're setting them up to fail, even if they're otherwise very, very bright. I think, when we start putting people in positions not based on whether they're prepared for them, but based on their racial background, that's just a disaster for everyone.
Let's talk about equity for a moment. I mean, the word equity in Canada seems to get a lot of play and has for
Yeah.
years. When I came to Canada, it was a word that I wasn't all that familiar with. The United States seemed to be more of a melting pot. Canada was more championing its multicultural character.
Well, I mean, it really depends on what people mean when they say equity, right? Do they mean let us give everybody the same treatment? And if you do, people are going to end up in very unequal places. Or do you say we want everybody to have equal outcomes, in which case you have to treat everybody very differently? Um, I see a lot of the equity people saying we have to treat people differently to try to get outcomes that are more equal. And a lot of the times, a lot of their prescribed solutions to equalize everybody is very much, as you say, a race to the bottom. One of the biggest examples of this is let us have higher minimum wage laws to try to equalize or redistribute income more. And if you look at studies and statistics or just basic, think about the basic economics. If you tell people that they have to, for example, sell their labor for $15 an hour, well, there are some people, workers with less skills or less experience or lower abilities who's are going to get priced out of the labor market. You see a lot of times when people say we have to raise the minimum wage, they say, well, people of a, disadvantaged background or maybe minority groups who tend to have a lower income. Um, the minimum wage will help raise their incomes more and help have more equal outcomes. And then you actually look at the data and what happens after you raise the minimum wage. And those very same groups that are said to be um, supposed to benefit from the policy, they're the ones who are getting priced out of the labor market and seeing higher rises in unemployment. And there's a very strong track record in the United States of evidence showing that minority youth and especially Black teenagers tend to get priced out of the labor market when you have large and rapid increases in the minimum wage. That's it seems like a very destructive social justice policy, but it's one that's always out there, nevertheless.
Social injustice, the broad stroke. Did you have any data or any perspectives on how the world really looks at Canada? Canada seems to be really good at beating itself up. Does the rest of the world see us this way? Or are we still viewed as nice, gentle, easy to get along with, never to be riled? Any perspectives that reflect on us as a nation?
Well, I mean, one way you can always look at it is where is the immigration flowing? And I think the desirability of Canada as a place to live is evidenced by the fact that you have large numbers of immigrants always wanting to come here, and far more than we are able to allow into our country. Um, and actually, if you look at the data of how I mean, Canada really is an immigration success story. And if you look at the ways that immigrants prosper in Canada, I think I don't see any evidence that people are you know regarding Canada as any kind of um, a horrible place to live. Now we do have a lot of problems. I was reading in The Economist a while ago about how Canada is, in some respects, on our national defense, we're back at the children's table. You look at our economy, it's taking a pretty bad slide in the wrong direction, I think, in a lot of metrics with very slow GDP growth and so on. But on the whole, I think Canada is still a nation with relatively high levels of freedom and prosperity, certainly compared to most parts of the world, and is certainly regarded that way.
Media. Seems to me that over the last few years, we've seen a shift that so much of what we talk about is stimulating fear, or at least anxiety. That by talking about all of these social issues and all of our weaknesses and all of our flaws, as if somehow that's going to, we'll respect them, we'll take advantage of them, we'll change our behavior, we'll be even better to one another. The media really seems to play this up. Is it just getting a lot of eyeballs? Is that why media is spending so much attention on social injustice? If it's not that serious, why does the media give it so much attention?
One of the best examples of what you just described is the issue with the residential schools. And remember, we had, was it which summer was it that Justin Trudeau had all the Canadian flags on all the federal buildings lowered for
Right.
a number of months, and there was, big flap about mass graves and all that. And here we are,
A big flap.
I forget however many months later, or well over a year later, and no bodies have been excavated. There's all that big flap turned out to be, um, you know, uh, it was just the prime minister and some other, social justice people trying to make a splash. And I think, anytime there's something that is that heavy in politics, and I guess anything the prime minister does and that pervades government policy is going to be newsworthy. And that's why we see so much of it in the news.
Okay, so that means, I mean, you used the name Justin, and you used the prime minister by way of example as a leader, setting the tone. I don't want to get deep into politics, but if this is a liberal perspective, will it shift if we're not liberal anymore? At least we're not run by a liberal government anymore.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, the government and the culture are always mirroring each other, but I think this particular government is so invested and so steeped in the social justice stuff, they can't turn back. And I think, certainly, if you have a conservative government, they tend to be, or at least they give the appearance of not being as concerned with playing up this aspect of society. I think right now it's just the way that the politics has shaken out, is we have a government that is so invested in it that they have to keep talking about it and playing it up, even if it's not a real serious issue to be dealt with.
One of our participants has frequently raised the rural-urban divide. Have you seen any socio-demographic and or regional disparities or differences around these topics?
It's hard to say. I mean, urban areas tend to be more to the left politically, and be more entrenched in this sort of stuff. That's also where a lot of this thinking tends to come out of universities. And when you have cities with um, a big university city, you're going to tend to have more of that type of thinking. And I think there's always regional disparities as well. I mean, Quebec is very different from Ontario, is very different from Alberta.
Well, we've certainly seen the discussion at the university somewhat different from what goes on in Main Street.
Yeah,
They've recently had that meeting in Washington with the presidents of MIT, Princeton, and Harvard, asked in the conclusion of that inquiry whether or not they on campus would tolerate a discussion about genocide of the Jews. And
yeah.
the president seemed to have gotten it wrong from a media perspective. They may have a different culture on campus than we have in Main Street. I don't know whether there's that much difference in Canada, though I do see from time to time where we seem to be pointing the finger at the universities not being in link with, and maybe they shouldn't be in link with me. Maybe they should be further ahead or more reflective. But anything you want to share with us about our academic culture and our communities?
Yeah, I mean, the universities, the thing about them is to a very large degree, their output is ideas. And whether those ideas actually work or not, or whether they reflect reality or not, seem not to get tested. In the real world, if you have an idea and it fails, then you'll know about it. An engineer who has a bad idea, who builds a bridge that collapses, is going to know about it.
Right.
A university professor who's, you know, goes off and spouts nonsense, as long as you know the idea is out there, and the idea may not actually get tested. You know, or if it gets shot down, well, it just gets brushed under a rug and moves on to the next grand idea. So that's really one distinction of universities, is that it's really a place where the output is ideas and not something tangible, or that and not it's not always tested or you know and that's I think a big problem with university. Another one I would bring up is that um, that kind of separates the universities from the real world is that universities are just so awash in government money. You know, I would take another example. If you go to the real world in a restaurant that does not serve good food is not going to um, be around for very long. But a university professor with bad ideas can just keep collecting the taxpayers' money, because one of the problems I always find with government spending is people doing the spending are not spending their own money. They're not too selective about where it goes, and you have a lot of public money being thrown after bad ideas.
Well, one might argue that allows them to exercise academic freedom. That if it was otherwise, we might be in a fascist or a totalitarian state where the government will dictate what the curriculum, which they do for grade school, but not necessarily for university. Every now and then the government does seem to stand up and take a stand regarding university excesses or whatever. And the students go to the legislature to protest, not to the alumni for help, which is the case where you've got more private investment or private dependence, or even student tuitions. But yeah, we have a public sector monopoly when it comes to our advanced education system in Canada, largely. And I think to that
Yeah.
degree, there is almost an excess of academic freedom.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have, you know, a public monopoly, or I mean, I wouldn't call it a monopoly in education, because there are a lot of, you know, private institutions as well, or maybe not a lot, but um, to some degree, there is a, you know, a lot of private money in education as well. But I think anytime you have, as you said, this excess, and you know, the government. I find there's a lot better quality control when you have when people have to compete and show the value of their ideas and the value of their product, and you get that a lot more in a private market than when you just have, you know, government funneling money into a system.
Well, we could spend a lot of time on monopolies and public sector financing, whether health, education, you name it. And
Yeah.
we have discussed in our webinars on homelessness that the source of many deemed homeless today are falling out of our public service system. They're not prepared, but then might also argue, well, where did they come from in the first place that led them into those systems? So, and that takes us into discussions of parenting and family. And I've mentioned in earlier webinars that I was stunned many years ago when I was talking to the School of Social Work in Calgary. And one of the profs stood up and made reference to the fact that the family was archaic and the state in future would be the educator of our children. And with smaller families and with growing influence in everything from daycare on up to the academic influence, the parents as a source of shaping a child's behavior is almost secondary now, with the number of hours spent to the number of hours a teacher has access to the kids. Something seems to be out of balance. Maybe this is progression. Maybe we're making headway. Any views from an economist or whether we're making headway or not?
Well, I mean, I think you have to look at the best way to look at it is look at examples from history. I'm not aware of any. I think there's a pretty strong record of, um, societies flourish more when you have a strong family, and as opposed to, having government play roles in, dictating how children are raised and so forth. Actually, if we can return back to Thomas Sowell had a great section of this in his book on social justice, and he said, you know, one of the one of the shifts towards education in schools versus at home is the infusion of sex ed into schools. And one of the uh, things of data that he looked at is in the United States, things like teenage pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases were actually on the decline uh, for a long time. And once you put the sex ed into the schools, those things started rising, or if they were declining less slowly. And he said, this is a great example of, the state has tried to step in to do something and overtaken the role of the parents, and the outcomes do not appear very favorable.
Yeah, he talks about unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Inconvenient truths. I mean, that really did stand out in the book, that when government under I think it was Johnson with his great social reform introduced various programs, whether it was affirmative action or sex ed in the schools, that we opened up a dialogue, and the consequences were not quite what was expected. In fact, turned out to be the reverse.
Yeah, I mean, the way I always look at it is, do parents care about their children more, or does the government care about those children more? And it's the same thing with money. Do you care about your own money more, or does the government care about your money more? And I think in all cases, we can say we care about our own families and our own children and our own money a lot more than, a politician or a bureaucrat in Ottawa cares about our children or our money or our families. So I think having decisions made at the family level and the individual level tend to generate much more favorable outcomes than this centralized decision making from government.
Well, certainly the family has both accountability and responsibility, whereas the education system that says it just has responsibility.
One of the interesting things about society is, and I mentioned Gary Becker earlier in his research about discrimination in society, and he pointed out that at least in the economic sphere, when you have competitive markets, that tends to root out a lot of discrimination, because discriminating against people is unprofitable for businesses. If you turn away customers of a certain color, you're going to lose business. If you don't hire people or of a certain color, you're going to pay more for talent. It's a competitive disadvantage to act on discrimination. And to the extent that we have a free and open and competitive economy and society, we're going to have reduced incidences of racism. And I think the general the general Canadian experience is that we're a pretty tolerant society.
We may be tolerant, but I'll share with you a story that was that I think has been shared numerous times, of white students on campus look to see whether Asian students are going into a class to decide whether or not they want to participate in that class, because of the highly competitive nature of the Asian student, who do far better and spend a lot more time in studying. It's a different culture when it comes to academia and what's expected of them. So yeah, we've got racism, but maybe in that respect, it's deserved.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call that racism.
I wouldn't either, but
that's it's it's if you looked at certain patterns or facts and make decisions based on them, that's very different from harboring resentment against people on the basis of race.
It's making a judgment based on someone's skin color. So that is racism, full stop,
you can,
according to what Perry has said in his example.
well, it's in a way, it's the reverse of what we're expecting. It's the white guy saying, hey, I'm the victim here.
But building on Matt's point, the market will sort that out. I was in a business class. I said, I can't believe you guys want to go into business because you won't put your hand up and engage.
Yeah.
So the market will sort things out, maybe not at the university market of marks, but in the real world of
Yeah.
people that are assertive and smart and work hard and don't try and fly under the radar. Those are the people that business rewards.
Going back to my own background, and I think many have shared it because I look around the room and some of you are nearing my age. One of the big issues many years ago was men and women, that men were not sensitive enough. We didn't have feelings. We needed to listen better. That women had to break through the glass ceiling, that they were being deprived of opportunity. They were coming out of the home, out of the kitchen. They wanted to participate, and they felt they were being held back. Have we made progress on that front without having a bunch of government intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. To some degree, I think it's just shifting preferences and a shifting culture, right? It may be that many decades ago, for example, you had lower female employment rates because they were more staying home and looking after the family. And that may just be different preferences back then and different ways people thought about division of labor in the household versus how people think about it now.
Well, it seemed to be a period where we wanted to deny that there were differences. And I'm not quite sure that where to go with that topic, because there are those that say to me, look, we've got to recognize the difference because those differences are very valuable. They shouldn't be cited as a negative. The differences in sensitivities, or the differences in educational capabilities may be real contributors to society. So we seem to take differences often as a sign of something bad, as opposed to acknowledging diversification or diversity as a good feature of a country, good feature of a company. Dawn, you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I can't help but jump in on this one. I think that, the whole male, female discussion, being someone who grew up in the, women's liberation movement and so forth, and also a host of experiences of the way you're treated in the workplace, which I won't go into in detail, some positive and some negative, but I've really been thinking about this a lot lately because I think for the most part, the upper echelons are dominated by men as the leaders and decision makers. Yes, there's a few women here and there, but that leads the world to be governed in a certain way. And I can't help thinking about these special characteristics that men have and women have, and playing to our strengths. But sometimes when we're too heavily dominated by one sex, I think that there becomes an imbalance. And I go back to Indigenous people and the role that man versus women played. And before any big decisions were made, the grandmothers would weigh in, because it's more of a matriarchal society. But there was more of a balance there between what the men wanted to do and what the women thought was best, and so forth. And I think that we haven't had that balance in our settlers that have been here, let's say in Canada and other places. I don't think that we've enjoyed that balance since the Europeans settled here. And I think that the current state of our world speaks to that. If we take a look at what's happening, I think our outlooks, the way we look at the world, men and women, are a little bit different, very complementary. And I think the two have to exist together. So I just wanted to toss that out.
I want to move off of Dawn and back to some of the initial stuff, because Dawn, I think I have a different perspective when we're looking at the difference between misogyny and racism. So I want to get back to the structure we were talking about as far as the government determining these woke, if we want to call them that. Some people would look at, I would say, the rainbow religion, critical race theory that we started with, and climate change as being elements that are seen as government pushing the agenda and actually providing a level of reverse discrimination and even more harsh. The steel wheel of tolerance is sometimes more crushing than the right wing looking at creating ways of when we look at multiculturalism, for instance, ways of structuring things to differentiate them. And the differentiation of that, when we talk about racism, I think is colored by a really corrupted form of understanding what race and racism actually means. It becomes if you've been a freedom person working in any close proximity to unions or NDP, you're called racist.
Yeah.
So the concept of racism is not actually well defined. And I think when we look at multiculturalism, and I've been working right now with developing a way of integrating persons who are from different cultures and faiths into a political system where they have the say, because in actual fact, when we say the government is telling us this, the government serves us. So we've already got a misinformation going on here that the government is responsible for doing that. It's us who are represented by them in our way of Westminster electoral process. One last thing on the coalescing of different groups and how they do that. We know, for instance, the Sikh truckers right now own the industry. They're in Edmonton, Alberta. Sorry, for those who aren't in Edmonton. We know that there are Italian towns, Chinese town, Somali Muslim areas. We have different areas where resources and assets that they need are there that are able to then bridge them into the communities. And we talked about settlement or resettlement. Both the indigenous people in Alberta and the people who are culturally diverse and still not integrated have similar resettlement issues in that they don't have a voice, because we have not learned how to, if we look at this group here, how to integrate communications between cultures and or languages that are so different. There are now technologies available and even use of good informatics, things like the climate boondoggle that's out there right now. I don't see Yogi here, but certainly informatics and actual analysis that's visual versus this narrative that comes from either the left or the right, and giving people the decision on which side they want to go to makes a lot more sense than the way I'm hearing it framed here now. So we do need a level of racism or race recognition that has a positive response and has a positive impact on the diversity, I think, that Perry's talking about.
That's supposedly the positive multiculturalism, but do you want to jump in there, Matt, on any point that Dale's
Thank
making?
you.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, if I can, I now forget who made this point, but you know, we were talking about the differences either between the sexes or between the race, and I think, you know, the differences are essential. We can't all have everybody be the same. That would not work out well. And because my background is economics, I always return to that. The whole foundation of a modern economy is you specialize in one thing and you trade with everybody else, right?
We are becoming clearly multicultural. I mean, we have been multicultural, but there's major shifts going on in terms of the representation of certain continents, nations, religions. So maybe all this discussion about social justice is timely. We as a nation have spent a century building the nation, and by that I mean engineers and railroads and economy and harvesting our natural resources, and increasingly are in the service business. And when you're in the service business or you're involved in marketing, you really have to understand your socio-demographics. Tolerance becomes an increasingly relevant issue, and some of the differences will become exaggerated. The relevance of unions for giving people fair advantages become more important. So maybe this discussion has been timely, given some of the shifts that are going on in the society at large. And does an economist see this?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you have changes, and obviously the the change in the demographic makeup of the country, and immigration is a huge economic issue today. And I think it is you know on a lot of different levels, right? First, you have, are they adding to the pressures with housing prices? Are they adding to the healthcare crisis? Or on the other side of it, are they filling worker shortages? Will the CPP become unfunded if we don't have new workers coming in and paying into it? I think, the way I always look at immigration is, again, returning to economics, is that the degree to which you can trade is always beneficial, because the more people you can trade with and the more people interact with, the more options you have in an economy, and the more specialized you can be. And there's always pros and cons of immigration, but I think generally the outcomes are quite positive.
Well, it's been the North American experience. I mean,
Yeah.
virtually everyone, including the indigenous, arrived here. And the blending and the mixing, sure, there were moments of violence, but there were moments of violence before colonialization. Some maintain that colonialization was the bringing of law and order into a world, whether it was in India or even in China. What we've seen in the last century is a reduction of tribalism. Yes, we've had some world wars, but as a society at large, the globe is reflecting more law and order than before. And is that a byproduct of colonialism? Probably it was. Thank you, the English. Was it associated with some degrees of violence and conquest? Thank you, the Spanish in South America. Absolutely. Don, I would like to pick up on the domination of women by men. I think at that time we had a different socio-demographic structure. We had a different economy. Women had a different role, and we've made a transition in the last century, a positive one, and it took advocates to make the case. Maybe it would have happened on its own, women in the workforce, without a lot of protesting, but they certainly protested and got their vote, and to that extent, it did require advocacy.
Yeah, it goes beyond that though, Perry. I think that we look at the world just a little bit differently. I think if I just might generalize a bit, I mean, women look at the community and the family, and they want, people to be well looked after and for everyone to get along, Whereas I think men look at the world a little bit differently, and a bit more competitive, a bit more win-lose. And the two go hand in hand. I think they're good under different circumstances, and it lends a little bit of a balance when you have the two.
One might argue, and I don't want to make a big point of it, but
Yeah.
because I think this could head us in the wrong direction, but
Right.
Women showing those characteristics are coming out of the home, where their role in the home was to reflect all of those values. It's conceivable that once they get into the workforce, they're going to become more like men.
Well, I don't know. It's kind of, if you take a look at kind of when we were hunting and gathering and the functions that we fulfilled then, I mean, I think some of this is rather innate, based on the roles that we play. And, I don't know that it's a good idea that, we be a lot alike. I mean, I think that you're bringing different strengths to the table, and together you're stronger than you are individually. I'm just saying that I think we're in a world now that it's being governed more so by men than women. And I think there's an opportunity cost to that. The influence of women is really, really important too. And the way they look at the world and maybe make decisions and so forth. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it in a competitive sense. I'm saying let's take advantage of these unique characteristics that we bring to the table that might provide us with a better decision making at the end of the day.
Anytime we put a label on anybody, it's an ism. You were just exhibiting sexism by making a sweeping generalization of women vis-a-vis men. Diversity is infinite. Every single one of the 105 billion people on this planet have a unique lived experience that no one else has had.
Yeah.
So to put anyone under any label, that's the trap we fall into.
Interesting.
All those isms, colonialism, racism, sexism, ageism, nationalism, tribalisms, put labels on people. The problem of labeling through things like affirmative action in the 60s, we talk about, I've been called at a peace museum seminar, an old white guy, by a female woman of color who's accomplished in peace studies. Labels cause problems. It's not right. It's not Canadian. It's not a source of strength. It's not a source of financial wealth. And then trying to fix it by counseling people who are white and privileged or colonialists. I'm a white from a family that's been in Canada for 200 years. I'm not a settler. We came as Scottish refugees. And by the way, we brought our Scottish bread, which became Indian bannock. So I'm just 10 more seconds. What our police chief said in Calgary 2 weeks after George Floyd was killed, and it's obvious that there's colonialism and racism and all of this stuff has been there. He said the right thing, in my opinion, and I'd like to hear it from others. He said, don't talk to me about counseling. Don't talk to me about colonialism, racism. Give me evidence, and Matthew, this is probably in your wheelhouse, of disproportional outcomes, i.e. 5% of people are Indigenous, but 50% are in jail. Let's get the evidence that there are some problems with some barriers or some isms out there, and we will take action to address them.
You want to add anything here, Matt, or weigh in?
Well, I mean, I think I would take issue with a few things. One of them is, I don't think recognizing, for example, that men and women are very different is a form of sexism. I think that's just recognizing reality, right? I mean, I would not say, for example, all men this and all women this, but clearly there are essential and very clear differences between men and women, I would point out.
Yeah, the course I took in undergraduate on logic focused on all, some, or none. And we seem to get caught up in the some wanting to be portrayed as all. And the sociologists, the psychologists have a lot of trouble with sociologists because sociologists need labels. And with those labels, in order to discuss the common groups, they're obviously denying an element of individualism. And that's the focus of many of the webinars that we have, is this tension between the public perspective, where they put everybody in a mass or in categories, and the individual. And that tension is what politicians are supposed to be managing, is this wish to use the public force to make good and advance society without the individuals having to pay a lot of prices. And in fact, that the majority prosper and that we don't leave too many minorities behind. Therein lies the challenge of leadership today around issues of social justice, whether it be the schism between men and women when it does show up, or the schisms between Indigenous and others. These differences will exist, and they always will, and the politician will play some role in trying to mediate and bring them both forward and add elements of tolerance. But sometimes the politicians become divisive. We see that south of the border, and I think we've seen some of that in Canada, where the wish not to build a bridge, but the wish to make someone feel guilty and rise the level of the victim so they feel welcomed. And I'm not sure that divisiveness has been constructive in building our society. I think it's pushed us further apart. Barry, you want to add anything here down in Canmore?
I sure do. I'd like to change the dialogue on trying to rationalize what we did in the past and how we tackle the future. From a global standpoint, I'm a firm believer we're living through the age of another age of wealth transfer, and it's going west, not just within our country, but across the globe. And we've got so mired down in spending money and if the money's not there, printing more. We've converted ourselves to a economy that does not, and I repeat, does not get anybody's investment attention. We got one of the biggest land masses in the world, the second largest, and almost no population relative to other countries. How do we, why do we accept the fact that the citizens of Canada are responsible for all the ecological impact that's happened in Canada? But we don't look at the real issue, and that is how do we get enough resources around us? How do we better use our multicultural picture in this country, reality in this country? How do we better use that to try and repair the adversity to investing in Canada by people from outside of Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think in all economic questions, and particularly investing, the market does a lot of work in terms of directing resources to the most productive use, and that's what economic growth is all about. Is increasing productivity, and when you have people spending money or directing money that's not theirs, which is generally what we see with a lot of government intervention in the economy, you're going to have a lot of waste. So I'm very much a free market guy, and I think in terms of spurring that economic growth, you just need to hack away at large amounts of government spending and do away with a lot of the regulatory barriers we have.
As someone who has spent much of his career in government roles, I have to agree with you totally, Matt. And but how do we internally focus on this problem? Because without solving this problem, we're not going to have the wealth to do very much less than we have in the past.
Well, I mean, in terms of what one person can do themselves to increase, the productivity of the country, I don't know that there's anything an individual can do other than making himself more productive or herself more productive. I think economic questions at the heart are really about productive uses of resources. At the individual level, I don't see too much a person can do other than with the resources he or she controls.
I wanted to thank Greg because the racism issue that I had brought up was very related to that. That anytime we look at the identification of any specific group, we start to add a necessity for qualification. So when we look at things like Matt, when we're looking at the development of productivity, and we add on the ESGs and the DEIs as elements within that, and we find countries that have had very high ESG scores fail, like Sri Lanka. Are we also putting a false economy into the equations that you're using?
Yeah, I mean, the ESG and the DEI, the whole. I mean, I'm not big on either one, and you mentioned that there are a lot of countries or companies, and there's been a lot of studies on this, who get high DEI or ESG scores, and if you look at their practices and their outcomes, they're not very good at all. I don't have much faith in either the ESG or DEI.
But isn't that what the government, and especially as we look at the Canadian government and Trudeau, and we look at climate, CRT, and the rainbow religion, aren't those the elements that we're seeing being injected into what is becoming a less stable and less robust or innovative ecosystem?
Yeah, a lot of the ESG and DI initiatives and so forth are the result of regulation and pushed from the top down and not bottom up. I would certainly agree with that.
Well, the question in my mind has always been, should government lead or follow? I mean, in a democracy, presumably, government primarily plays a role in hearing what the democracy, hearing what the voter, even the minorities have to say, and writing policy after the fact, not before the fact. And so it's going to be a little bit slower. But social intervention or social activism by government saying it is a bit like Plato's Republic, where the philosopher kings are in charge and they're going to take us forward because they're smarter than we are. I mean, Churchill was rather complimentary, and I think through the 300 years or the 500 years of democracy, we've seen that, as clumsy as it may well be, it's the governments that are totalitarian in nature that tend to get it wrong. And we've got to be tolerant in a society that, yeah, there are going to be inequities, and we're working on it, and hopefully we're making progress. And there may be call for advocacy when things are really way out of balance, but when government jumps in and your contracting, for example, has social credits in it that far exceed the economic credits, you're headed backwards.
I mean, with a lot of the talk about democracy or government leading or following, to me, a lot of questions are not democratic questions. I'll give you an example. The question as to whether you should put garlic in a certain dish or what vegetables you should eat for dinner. That's not a democratic question. We don't all go to the grocery store and take a vote and all of us will eat garlic or none of us will eat garlic, right? To me, a lot of these questions lie with the individual, and or I would go back to my previous point. It's the individual or the family that should be making a lot of these decisions, and government should not lead or follow it. A lot of things should just get out of the way is really my point of view.
But government does feel the pressure of minority groups today far more than they ever did before. At least they're acting in response to minority pressures. Taking food, for example, I mean, the government does get involved in food and nutrition and taking positions that have a bearing on what we do. And some feel that the food industry lobbies government too much to make sure that it keeps a lot of sugar in our diet and blah, blah, blah. So how to make sure we've got a proper balance? And it's never going to be right in a democracy. We have to accept that. Dawn, go ahead.
I was just thinking that I think we're really being influenced more than ever today by, the impact of what's on social media. There's a lot of information hitting us all the time from all sorts of different sources. And it gives certain interest groups a chance to kind of build narratives or build the impression that, they're speaking very loudly and in great numbers. And I think we really have to be careful with that, because sometimes that's not exactly giving us a clear picture. And I wanted to speak to the differences. I mean, I think we have more similarities in common than we do differences. I mean, I do work here in Canada and I do work abroad in a number of different countries, and my entire team is all from different countries. We have way more in common than we do not. And I think what's important is that we sit down and we listen to one another, and we get together and talk. And I mean, the same could be said for, this is some advice for some of our government officials, is to really listen to their constituents and have those conversations and that dialogue, because some of the other stuff that's happening over here on social media is just nothing short of sensational, really. And I think we have to find a way to give ourselves a reality check and ask ourselves the question, is this a narrative, or is it, what can I base this in, some sort of fact? We have to be very careful with that.
Well, the people that typically speak up, Dawn, when invited at an inquiry, are people that are going to complain. Yeah. And so you're more likely to hear of the complaints that are not shared by the majority, by those in marketing in the hotel industry. 7 people, if they've had a bad experience, 7 people will know if an individual's had a bad experience, but only 1 will know if they had a good one. And so social media is dominated by people complaining. And media picks up on that, because that makes an interesting story. Because the more extreme the story, the more eyeballs sometimes it gets. This is called critical thinking. And when we ask, and we'll explore this next week, the rising issues of mental health with teenagers, they are not of an age yet with enough life experience to know how to filter out the extremes from the norm. And they get caught up in those extremes. Greta's a good example. Greg, keep it to 30 seconds if you would.
Yeah, Matthew, thank you for this perspective that markets will sort things out. Diversity results in better commercial decisions, better government decisions, better decisions in the not-for-profit. And all those organizations live in markets. So that's a massive part of the solution. ESG is just another flavor of sustainability, you know, the fourth or fifth reiteration of triple bottom line. And just picking up your comment on DEI, I'm totally with you. I think that's actually making things worse, is more discriminatory than before it came up. ESG, just look at conscious capitalism. They wrote a book called Firms of Endearment, and they did the research and made the proof that businesses that take care of people, their customers, employees, and communities, and take care of the planet make more money. So markets are the best invention of humanity. They don't work perfectly, but they do work.
I think that the general tenor, Matt, picks up on this tension that exists between taking a public perspective where anyone in the public is typically working with categories. They break the society into those that have a problem and those that don't have a problem. And they make a living at those conflicts and trying to either resolve them or take sides and get credit for having taken side. Where at the individual level, we often get lost in those arguments, wondering, well, do I have to take side? Do I fall into that category? That public-private tension, which is what our webinars are all about, it is very volatile right now.
Yeah.
Because the public has taken stands on many social issues, which we never talked about in society before, because government was so involved in the economic issues of building a nation, building its roads, building its schools, building the public services. We were in a building phase. Now we're operating, and in that operation, you're getting the sense and the feelings of whether or not there's a proper balance. Individuals are feeling that they're being drawn into a conversation they've never been drawn into before. I can remember growing up when segregation in the South was the big issue and Kennedy was the new president, and there were strikes and there were lynchings going on. And we as eighth graders needed to weigh into it and take positions, and we had no background whatsoever. And when you see dogs attacking kids and you hear about lynchings, God, you became angry. And you got on buses and you went south and you asked the government to take positions, which you hadn't been at the national level involved in before till Kennedy really stood in. A lot of decisions have been made to try and rectify rights, not often resolved by government. Some of these things are only going to get resolved over time because they're cultural. Look what happened in Bosnia. Look what's happening in Ukraine. Some of these things will fester for centuries. Even with government involvement, whether the United Nations can help or not. What's going on in Israel today? Will it get resolved? Will we have to put some peacemaker between the two of them for another century or two, expecting it will resolve, or we just put up a barbed wire fence and live with it? Matt, I'm going to give you the last word. I don't see any hands up. It's been a delight to have you here, to serve as providing insight and helping us understand some of the tensions that are false, the fallacies as they're talked about. But I'll give you the last word. Anything you want to share with us as a learning or an insight? Matt.
No, I think that was a good wrap up, Perry. You know, it's all about striking the balance and trying to figure out which are the public questions versus what can be resolved privately. I think is a very sharp insight that you made.
Well, I'm delighted to have an economist showing, because so often it's follow the money. And even on these social issues, there are people that feel, well, it's going to get resolved in the market as a byproduct of what people are buying or not buying. And yet government gets involved in mucking up the market. I can recall as a management consultant to one of the national telecoms, where I was saying to them during the privatization phase, you've got to start listening to your customer. They will be driving your profits in the future. And they said, you don't understand. We make our money in negotiating with the regulator. We get a law or a rule put in place that will guarantee our profits. They didn't give a damn about the customer. What they gave a damn about was getting government on side. And so they spent a lot of money on lobbying. And that to me is where we need to always keep our mind wide open of the importance of balancing. And the word you used a moment ago, whether it be in social matters or economic matters, government plays a role, but it's got to be balanced. And it can't be heavily interventionist and can't be heavily proactive.